다들 다들 님들이야 아주 그네가게 어 다 긴준 pomore 다는 신기 지 잘람칸
I would like to offer my welcomes to all the monks and nuns from the different Kagyu monasteries and nunneries, as well as all of my Dharma friends who are listening over the internet. So I'd like to offer you my welcome. Yesterday we were speaking about the deities from the texts or the Vedic literature, the Vedic period. So yesterday we spoke about the gods in the heaven, the first section, and the second were the gods in the air, the gods in between, and we've gone through those. And now the third is the gods of the earth. And so this is the point where we are now. When we speak about the gods when we speak about the gods on earth, generally, in terms of the gods of the earth, today I will speak about three of them. The first is Agni, and in Tibetan, or in translate, this is the fire god. The second is Soma. Some is like the god of an alcohol or also the god of the moon. So he is a particular god. And the third is Prithvi. This is probably the goddess of the earth. So I'd like to give an introduction to these three gods of the earth. Among the gods of the earth, the first of these is Agni, the fire god. And so the fire god, when I talk the fire god, in ancient times, this was a god who many people on the earth in the world worshipped. This is because fire was very important for the people on the earth, and for this reason, human beings would consider the fire to be like a form of a deity, to have the character of a god. In particular, in India, Agni, the fire god, became very important. In the Vedic literature, Agni is recognized as a very ancient god. And so I think Agni was originally one deity, but he became a single god with three different manifestations and forms. And so there's a sort of sequence. And so later in the Vedas, Agni took three different forms, and the first of these is the sun and the sky. And the second was the god Indra in the sky, and the third was the Agni. So they're three different forms, but in actuality, they're all emanations of Agni, or they're all the same in essence, being Agni in essence. And when we speak about this, the sun in the sky and the Indra in the sky, and talk about Agni, so it's as if Agni has control over the earth, the air, and the heavens. So in general, the sun and Igna and Agni, and talk about in the terms of they're the same in significance or the same in importance. And if you had to choose one among the three and to say that one is the important one, this is the most important, who was that? And you had to choose one, it probably would be this Agni, the fire god. And for this reason, the largest number of hymns are praises of Agni. And then the second would be to Indra. So Agni was very important. And the origin of the worship of Agni, or how this arose, is because they were making offerings to the fire god in fire office, and also because of the use of fire in daily life. And so it is from this that the tradition of worshiping Agni developed. And so in particular, what the people of that time thought is that if you put the offerings to be given to gods into a fire, then the gods would be able to actually enjoy them and actually consume them, enjoy them. So this is what they believed. And so for this reason, that the fire is what connected the humans to the gods, because you put the offerings into the fire, and then the god would be actually able to receive and consume them. And so for this reason, a fire was called the messenger of the gods. Was what made the connection between gods and humans. So like for us today, we have phones, right? That if we want to make a connection with someone else or contact someone else, we use the fire. And so it's through the phone that we're actually able to speak with our parents and our relatives. Similarly, in the old times, we couldn't actually see the gods. However, but what made the connection between the gods and the humans was to put the offerings to the gods in the fire, and then by that medium, the gods would be able to accept them. And in this way, the gods would also be able to hear and learn of the people's desires. And so fire was considered the messenger of the gods. In particular, when doing a fire puja, a fire was absolutely essential. And basically, and also, how could fire come about? And so if you rub two sticks of wood together, then a new fire would come. First, there's no fire. And then when you rub the two fire sticks together, then a fire is lit. And so for this reason, what the Indians thought is that Agni was the youngest of all the gods. And the reason is because at first he's not there, and then he arises newly. And so and the fire is lit. And so he's new at that point. And so among the gods, he is considered the youngest of the gods. Likewise, Agni is extremely powerful and extremely majestic. And the reason for this is that, one reason is that when we talk about the word gods in Sanskrit, this is called Deva. And the meaning of Deva means to illuminate. It means sort of light, or to illuminate. And it's because of the light from that the gods, powers of the gods are able to become evident. Or that the gods are able to bring out their power. And so for humans, even the fire on earth has light, and because of that light, then like the sun in the sky, it was able to illuminate things, and so in that way, so they considered the god in heavens to be a god, right? And so that just as the sun has the ability to illuminate all things and show all things, fire also had the power to be able to illuminate and show all things, and therefore they thought that fire also had a divine nature. And also, as I said before, fire is absolutely necessary for our lives as human beings. It's absolutely crucially important. And so this is a reason why people considered fire so important or so significant. So there are reasons for it, right? And so the idea of Agni being so important came from this. Now, Agni himself, when we think about Agni, we think that because of making offerings to Agni, what are the benefits of offering or worshiping Agni, or the powers of Agni? If we think of what are the powers of fire, one is that when you light a fire, it can dispel darkness. It also has the power to burn impure things. If you put trash in the fire, if you put it in a fire, then it burns up, right? And so since fire has these two qualities, what people at the time thought is that the fire god Agni also had the particular powers of being able to dispel darkness and to subdue demons. So what he's also, another name for him is Rakshahan. What this means is the demon slayer. So, like this demons or devils, right? So he was the one who was able to kill the demons. And so for that reason, Agni was also called the demon slayer. Also, in the Vedic period, everyone had in their own households, everyone considered offering fire pujas important in their own households. And when you're doing a fire puja, the main thing is you have to light a fire. Now, so even now, when we offer a fire, have a fire puja, we first invite the Agni, the fire god, as one of the worldly deities, and when we begin the fire puja. Similarly, in the ancient days, the main god of this is the deity Agni, and so for that reason, so another name of him is Grahaspati, which is means the lord of the household. So it's like the actual head of the household is the fire god. Also, when we are doing sacrifices, it's through the medium of the Agni, the fire god, that all the offerings are given to the deities. So for that reason, another name that he's called by is Havya Vahana. So Havya Vahana means basically the bearer of the sacrificial offerings. He's the one, the delivery person for these sacrifices. He's the person who takes them. So you need the delivery person to carry it. So who is the delivery person for the offering? It was Agni. He's the one who took the offerings that we humans had offered, and he brought them up to the gods. And that was Agni who did this. He was also called Dutta. This is calling him the messenger. He's called the messenger of the gods. And not only that, Agni also had other functions, such as ruling human beings or governing human beings, like regulating the laws of heaven and earth, which means overseeing all of the rules of karma and cosmic and earth. And he also had the power of omniscience. And so Agni had many different qualities and features. And so that is the subject of Agni. In any case, Agni, as you all know, is a god whom we encounter all the time when we give the fire pujas. As you all know, when we do the fire pujas, we're always saying Agni, Agni. When we recite this, we meditate on Agni. and make offerings to him, right? And so this is like the worldly ritual, and then we begin the transcendent, and we visualize, and then we make offerings to the deity, the Amandala, and all the various other deities, right? And so Agni is therefore also related to our secret mantra of Adriana rituals. Next is the second god of the earth. And the second god of the earth is Soma. You could probably call the god of alcohol, or the god of intoxicants. Now, one thing you all need to understand is the Brahmins really liked intoxicants. They really liked intoxicants. And because they liked intoxicants, what they thought is that since we like intoxicants, then the gods must also like intoxicants. And so better if we offer that to them, then it's good. That's what they would think, right? And so they believed that the gods also liked to be intoxicated. Likewise, also the gods Soma and Agna and Indra, right? So Indra in Tibetan is named Jajan, right? So between these three, Soma, Agni, and Indra, there is a particular connection. And the reason for that is that you have the intoxicant, the Soma intoxicating drink, has a power to get you intoxicated. So if you drink this intoxicant, then you get drunk, right? So how does that come out when they thought about it? And so you first have to cook I think you first have to cook this. And when you cook the intoxicant, then you need fire. And so for that reason, they'd say that you have to have there must be the power of Agni must enter the intoxicant, and then because of that, then the intoxicant has the ability to get you intoxicated. And then in terms of Indra, and it's because of Indra that the intoxicant gains potency, because he's able to, and because of that intoxicating power that he's able to it's because of the intoxicant that Indra is able to do many of his great deeds. And so Indra really liked to drink this alcohol or this drink, and he'd drink it at all. Then he'd get intoxicated, and then become really especially courageous, and then get very strong, and he'd be able to defeat and slay and to destroy everything. And so what they'd say is that the intoxicant has the power of Agni, and by drinking it, Indra then becomes stronger, because Indra then, through the power of gains all his strength through the power of Agni. So that is how they thought of it. So in belief, this Soma, this intoxicant called Soma, was a specific drink of the gods and ancestors. So it must have had a specially god in there, and so they decided there must be a god of it. Now, what this god is not something like this. The Soma intoxicant was something that all of the Aryan people had been drinking from their ancestral times. Their parents and their ancestors all drank it, and so this intoxicant was something that all our ancestors liked, and there wasn't anyone who disliked it. And so it's because this intoxicant that all the gods and humans get, because they feel happy, and why they get excited. And it's why they become really courageous. So we have to talk about the qualities of it. They're saying you have to drink, they're saying. You have to drink intoxicants. If you don't, and you get really good if you if you drink this intoxicant, it becomes really good. This wasn't just any old intoxicant. It was actually intoxicant that became divine by nature. And it was something that we presented, like when you talk about Amrita, right? In Amrita, this, actually, in essence, is actually this is probably just a sort of intoxicant. When you give something to the gods, it was alcohol. And when people would drink this, when you drank the alcohol that had been given by the gods, then you have long and healthy lives, they said. And so for this reason, people thought of the god of intoxicant Soma, how he was connected to humans is that he was connected to people's hopes and prayers for the future, because they thought if you drank this intoxicant, you'd be able to have a long life, and so they put their hopes in the god Soma. Likewise, later what happened is, later during the later Vedic period, at the end of the Vedic period, this god Soma then became also the moon god Chandra. So Soma is actually one of the names of the moon god Chandra. You could call him Soma, you could call him Chandra, the moon god, but in essence, it's the same in essence. And what this shows us is that during the time, the Vedic time, that the Brahmins like an alcohol, and that they considered it to have a particular potency. And so to speak about it in brief, the third god is the goddess Prithvi. This is a goddess named Prithvi. I think this must be the same as the Tibetan goddess Tenma. And the reason is that she's a goddess. I've spoken about many, some are said to be embodiments of the sky, some of them have been embodiments of the sun. And here it's thinking about this earth. This is also seen as the form of a god. And so Prithvi was considered an emanation of the earth. So in brief, because these gods in heaven had great powers and people felt great faith in them, likewise, the earth is the place where we all live. And so there's also, from ancient times, there was a tradition of recognizing her as a goddess. But gradually her status, though she was very significant at first, her status gradually declined. And she wasn't considered so important. At the very beginning, what they thought is that Prithvi was the mother who gave birth to everything, what produced all things. Because she's the ground, it's because of the ground that all things come. And so therefore the earth goddess, she's like the mother of all things. She's what gives birth to all things. Likewise, they also talking about the heavens, the earth joining together and coming into union, that all the gods were born from this union of the heavens and the earth. However, later, the tradition of worshiping and being devoted to the earth goddess gradually decreased. And the main reason for this is that the ground is what we step upon. So it's beneath your feet. So if the ground is beneath your feet, since you're always stepping on it when you walk, the tradition of having great devotion for her gradually was lost. So for this reason, if you compare her to other deities, there are very few devotees of the earth goddess Prithvi. And if you look in the texts of the Vedas, there are fewer hymns to Prithvi. And so that is the end of the discussion of the gods of the earth. So the other day I spoke about the three different types of gods of the Vedas: the gods in heaven, the gods in air, and the gods on earth. I'm talking about these three types, classes of gods. But there are also many gods who are not included among these. And so if you ask, are all the gods included in these three levels? No, they're not. But we discuss them because those are the because of their significance. And so now I would like to introduce a few of the other deities. Now, the gods who are not included in the gods of the heavens, the air, and the earth, among them, there's the first one is Yama, who in Tibetan is called Shinje, the Lord of Death. The second is Saraswata, and she's an important goddess, so I'd like to introduce her. And the third is Brahaspati. I'd like to give an introduction. In Brahaspati, and the fourth is Purusha. So the first is Yama. Now, one thing we need to know is that when you think about it, he comes up in our Mahakala texts, and there are many rituals connected with Yama, right? So the Yama is the Lord of Death, right? And so I need to give you the importance of Yama. And so how is he described in the Vedic literature? When I talk about the Yama, we think of him as a wrathful deity. It's kind of a coarse and rough deity, right? That's how we think of him. We think of him as wrathful, not so good. We don't really want to hear the name of Yama, the king of Dharma. But in ancient times, in the earliest Vedic texts, Yama was not a rough deity or not a terrifying deity at all. It's just that gradually, later people made Yama dark, thinking that being dark is bad. They gave some explanations of this, and they made him into a frightening deity. But in the beginning, Yama was not at all that scary. In the Vedic texts, when they sang hymns to Yama, the earliest hymns to him say of Yama that it's like, the sun sets every day, right? They praised him like praising the sunset. Now, sunset is personified as a god, or that the setting sun was basically a representation or a symbol of death. And the reason for this is that when the sun sets, it feels a little sad. And when our minds become sad and the sun sets, then naturally think that just as the sun sets, one day their life will come to an end and they will die. And so when the sun sets, we think that we're going to die, and so for that reason, and because of that, then there became a connection between between Yama and the future lives. Now, when we talk about future lives, when we talk about the terms of future lives, if they're future lives, then there needs to be a place where you go in your future life. There has to be a destination for your future life. And so there needs to be someone who rules over that place, a king of that area, right? So that's what people must have thought. And so who is that? Who is that king? Oh, that king must be Yama. The reason is that king is first connected to the appearance of the sun setting. And so not only did they identify the appearance of the setting sun as Yama, They didn't recognize him as an individual, but later Yamabika was thought about as like an individual, with like a human character, and so for that reason, gradually, Yama was identified as the king of the place where people would go after they had died. But the way we think of it, when we say that after we die, when you die, then the Yama, the king of death, is going to take you away. We think of that as bad, but at the time, ancient Indians didn't think that it was bad when you died. And the reason they thought of this is because when good people died, that after they died, they'd get a new body that radiated light. They'd have this new body, and where would they go? They would go someplace where there was a lot of shining light, a place where there is perfect happiness, to a new land or a new place. And so who was there? Who was there was the Yama, the King Yama. So they'd go and they'd live in the land of Yama. And they would stay in the presence of Yama, the king of death, and happily enjoying inexhaustible riches and enjoyments. So it's like a place you'd go and you'd spend your time happily. So at that time, Yama was the one that everyone was hoping for. The ruler, the king of the place where everyone wanted to go, a very loving and compassionate being, someone who had great love. And that is how they thought of Yama. However, later what happened is that Yama changed. At first, Yama was not a terrifying deity, but later, in India, there are different non-Buddhist hymns or Brahmanical texts. There's a set of texts called the Puranas. And within these texts, what it says is that Yama changed. He became the one who punished wicked wrongdoers, people who had done misdeeds, who had committed wrongs. After they died, he was the one who would punish them, who would treat them badly. And so he became a very cruel and terrifying deity. So when you think about that, there's the king of death we thought about. So, if you wonder if he is someone is Yama someone who's going to die or not, because when everyone else dies, he's the one who has to rule them, right? Well, so has he never died? He said. Now, this is an interesting question. There are stories about this in the Vedas, because Yama was the first person to die. There was no one who died before him. Before them, they'd known it. So he was the first person in the world to die. And the reason for that is at this time, people didn't die at the beginning. And the reason they didn't die is because at that time, people had no suffering. They didn't do any misdeeds. And for that reason, they never died. But what happened is eventually they began committing misdeeds. Suffering happened. They began to catch various illnesses. And for this reasons, then the fear of death, the mortality, the mortal nature happened. And because people were going to die, Yama, the king of death, was first like a king among humans, like us, but when he saw the situation, he brought his court along with him and went to another place, the land of the descents. But basically, so he went to a different place. He died. And he arrived at the world of the next life. And so the first person to rise there was Yama, the king of death. And so for that reason, he was the first person to go to the next life, and he was the one who ruled that place, and so became the king of the deceased. And so the reason why everyone was afraid of him at first was that he had two dogs. And these two dogs, he'd always send them as messengers to go see what people were doing in the earth. And when you looked at those two dogs, they were really, really terrible because they had 4 eyes each, not just 2, they had 4 eyes. They had huge snouts. And when you went to them, they had a really terrible stench. They really smelled bad. And because of this, people didn't like these 2 dogs at all, right? But at that time, the Yama, the king of death, was before the time that people started to suspect the king of death and be afraid of him. He was not the king of death, but at that point, but the 2 dogs, so they didn't think bad of Yama, but they really, that his 2 dogs, they thought bad. They had names for them. I don't need to give the names, the dogs. Likewise, Yama, actually, he had a sister. He had a sister. And actually, he and his sister were twins. And so he had a younger sister, and her name was Yami. His name was Yama, and his sister was named Yami. Later in the secret mantra, then we have Yama as the king of desert. It's called divided into 2. One is called Yamantaka, and the other is called Yama Dhamaraja, the king of the hells, right? The one who would punish the wrongdoers. He's like the king of hell. In the secret mantra, then Yama it comes in 2 different forms: the Yamantaka and the Dharma king of the hells. So that's the topic of the Yama. It's kind of complicated, but that's how it is. Now I've shown 3. The one riding on the bull is the Indian depiction of Yama. The one in the middle, or on the right, is the one in the middle is a wrathful depiction of Yamantaka, the wrathful Yamantaka in a Japanese, and then the other side is a Chinese, is the Yama, the king of death in the Chinese tradition. So, but the origin of them all is from India, Yama. So in Chinese they say Yama in Chinese, but the source or the origin is Japanese. But they have different appearances. So that is probably the same as the king of death and the Yama, the king of death in the Chinese tradition as well. Now, generally in the Vedas and the early Vedic period, there were not very many goddesses. Mostly were male gods. Even though there weren't so many goddesses, there were a few. And among them, the most important included the goddess Ushas, whom I spoke about yesterday, the goddess of dawn, and then another goddess was Saraswati. So Saraswati, most of you know of Saraswati. Later, there are also many very well-known goddesses. There's the Durga and Kali and Lakshman. So later in India, there were many well-known Indian goddesses, but they appeared gradually over time. When the Vedas first appeared, the goddesses had not appeared initially when the Vedas first appeared. So to speak about Saraswati, I think I can speak about that later. So next I'd like to speak about this one, Brihaspati. Now, Brihaspati is like the god of aspirations or prayers. The reason why there had to be a god of aspirations, a god of prayers, that he had to be different than other ones. Originally, all the gods came from something in the natural environment. There was something, and then it was that was called a god. But the god of prayer, the god of prayer, there's no thing that you can say this is the basis for the for the one of God. There's nothing. So it's like he was like so he's basically like a made-up God or an imagined God, his own made-up, who's come out of thought. So in brief, the reason why there needed to be this God of prayer is what people thought is that prayers and aspirations had great power. If you made a prayer, then you were able to gain influence over others. And that we are able to change the wishes of the gods through our prayers and aspirations. And so prayer had a particular power. So it must have had a divine nature or be a god, as this is how they thought of it. And so for this reason, there became this god of prayer. Now, the way this god of prayer arose is that just as they believe that there is a divine power in intoxicants and in fire, because intoxicants have the power to intoxicate you, and fire has the power to cook or to burn all things. So they recognize them as being gods. Similarly, aspirations also have that ability to gain influence or power over others, or to influence the thoughts and the wishes of the gods. And for that reason, there originated this god of aspirations, Brihaspati. At the beginning, he wasn't such an important deity. Later, Brihaspati became an important one, particularly in the non-Buddhist times, in the Upanishads, which we talk about. So Genji Tripa translated this Tibetan by the Tibetan word nirgu. It can also be translated as the secret text, but in any case, it's an important non-Buddhist text. And within that, Brihaspati, the god of aspiration, is identified as an extremely important deity, and he's given the name Brihaspati. Later, there are the texts called the Puranas, which is another type of Hindu literature. And so in the Puranas, he is asserted to be the highest, he's one of the three great gods. He's basically identified as being Brahman. So at the beginning, Brihaspati. So later he became the creator of the world, and he was recognized, and he was thought of as the creator of the world. And that creator of the world was later recognized as being Brahma. So later they said that it was Brahma who was the creator of the world. So when in the early Vedic period, they didn't consider Brahma so important, but later, first there was the Brihaspati, later when the texts establishing the Hindu views appeared, they started to take a lot of interest in who was the creator of the earth, how did the world get developed, and then they spoke about Brihaspati as the creator of the world, and then later Brahma was said to be the creator, and so after that, then Brahma became one of the three great deities, so Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and that's the reason why he was considered one of the what's said to be those three main deities. And then the next one is Purusha. Purusha says,
치르기 릉중 감 미생에 이렇게
It's better. And here's another imagined deity. He's not someone who is identified based on some feature of the natural world. Instead, he was thought up through the mind, I think. So when we talk of Purusha, normally when we look at the non-Buddhist texts, they talk about a self or a soul. So this is what the word means. Purusha means the self or a soul. So he's considered to be one of the most ancient, the earliest of the gods. He's said to have 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes, and 1,000 arms, similar to our 1,000-eyed, 1,000-armed Chenrezig. However, later Purusha began to be identified as like the nature of the world, or like the soul, or the self. Or you can talk about as consciousness, or the self, or the soul. And say that all things come out of the expanse of the self and appear. And so for that reason, Purusha became very important. And it's particularly when the philosophic texts began to appear. After that, then Purusha, the world, and so they spoke about everything being a manifestation of the mind, as we say in Buddhist texts. And similarly, they said all things came out of the expanse of the self. And so for that reason, the Purusha became very important. Similarly, the praise or the hymns to Purusha, are very important. And the reason for this is that are representative of the initial start of the caste system. As we often say, that we talk about that like the Brahmins being born from the forehead and so forth. It's related to this. The tradition of a caste system is related very closely to the god Purusha. And so for the time being, I've given the introduction to the gods. And following this, I'll speak about, we've got 30 minutes, right? Have the 30-minute break, and then we'll come reconvene and continue. I'll continue speaking then.
So, that
First, what I'd like to is give you an introduction to the goddess whom I left out a moment ago, the goddess Sarasvati. So I'd like to give you a brief introduction to her. So Sarasvati originally in the Vedas is the goddess of all the rivers. And in particular, in the Rig Veda, she is described as having special powers to cleanse all people of impurity, to increase wealth and prosperity, and to increase courage and the children. And so these are the great benefits, the great abilities, and the great benefits she brought. Now, these are her special, as we often say that as Sarasvati and Sarasvati and the wealth gods, because if you President Norjunma, the wealth goddess, and if you then Sarasvati gets jealous. If you practice Sarasvati, then the Norjunma can visit. So those who so it's said like poets are often very poor, and the rich people often have bad literary skills. But in the Vedas, Sarasvati, her origin is the one who increased wealth and prosperity. But later in the Brahmanas, or after the appearance of the Brahmana texts, then she became the god of words or of language. Likewise, she also became the goddess who increased a debate and increased prajna, or intelligence. Later, then she became Lakshmi. And so Saraswati is also recognized as being Lakshmi. In any case, Saraswati also became one of the texts in the text in the text in the. So I'd like to continue speaking with what I was speaking before. And so to continue with where I left off, what I'd like to speak about next are the Maras, or the demons. After we've spoken about the gods, then there's no choice but to talk about the Maras. And these in Sanskrit are called Maras. Now, even when we're speaking about demons, there are many different types of demons, but the three primary ones, I'm talking about the classes. There are three main classes of Maras, three that I would like to discuss. The first of these are the demigods, or the asuras. And the second class, set of is called the rakshas. So this is what we call in Tibetan simpo. And the third class of deities is the pishachas, or the flesh eaters. So these are the pishachas. So of these three, the first group is the demigods, or the asuras. In order to speak about the asuras, we first in order to give an introduction to the demigods, so generally, first of all, the word for demigod in Sanskrit is asura in Sanskrit. That's the word they used, right? Asura. Now, the Sanskrit word asura, and also the Persian religion, or sometimes they call the Parsic, the Persians, the Zoroastrian religion. So these days in English we call them the Persians. In terms of present-day geography, they live in the region of Iran. So this is a culture, the civilization that flourished in that region. It was a very advanced civilization. They had a religion, and the name of that religion is Zoroastrianism. So the name of the religion is Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism, and that's the religion that appeared. And the main part, primarily, they're mainly a worship of the fire gods, and they were devoted to the fire god primarily. And this is considered one of the most ancient religions in the world. Within it, the word that they use is the word ahura. And the word ahura and the Sanskrit asura are the same word. The reason why they're the same is, as I said before, the other day, the founders of the Persian civilization were Aryans, and the people who founded the Indian civilization were Aryans. So the Aryans, who says that they were the first, they came from Central Asia, and when they came, there are many different explanations of it, but in one explanation, what happened is that they came, they arrived in India, when they arrived in India, and after they arrived in India, they split into two camps or two groups. One went over to continued on to Punjab, and one continued out of India to the area of present-day Iran. And so later they're called the Persians. And so in Tibetan we say Parsik or Tarsik in Tibetan. But so this is they founded that, so the Persian civilization. So these people had started originally, they lived together and they had the same language because they'd lived together, right? So their language was the same. And so for that reason, Persian and Sanskrit are very similar languages. There are a lot of similarities between the two. And in particular, in Sanskrit, we say Asura. And the Persian Zoroastrian religion, and they have a text, the text they have, the Avesta is the name of the Zoroastrian text. They have the Avesta text. It's kind of like the Christian Bible. And within that, there's the word Ahura. The word's the same. But the difference is that in the Vedas, the Asuras are the gods of the side of darkness. But in the Persian religion, Ahura is the gods of the light. And so this is a big difference. Now, the reason, the history or the historical support for that, if we look at it, if we research this, then probably the Indian Aryans and the Persian Aryan peoples, the reason at the time that the reason they split is they first had come together, they lived together, and then the reason why they had to go to different reasons, it's probably related to that. However, at that time, what the actual events were is something we can't really speculate about. Because before you speculate, we don't have enough historical evidence to make any hypotheses. So I think it's probably something like that. But it's difficult to say it really clearly. But if you talk about the Avesta, the religious text of the Zoroastrians, it's a very long text. It covers a lot of topics. In terms of the number of words, it probably had over 35,000 words. And the words and what they were written on was actually on sheepskin. It's probably sheepskins or maybe lambskins. Probably 1,200 sheepskins. It's written on the skins, right? In the old days, they read on vellum or on skin, right? So before there was paper, people would write on vellum, which is skin, and they probably used sheepskins, and it took 1,200 sheepskins to write down this entire text, the Avesta. At the time when this was compiled, it was probably around the 4th century before Christ. Later, the Greek Emperor Alexander invaded Persia, and when he invaded Persia, he took that sacred text and he burned it in fire, and after buying it and destroyed it. And so he burned the text, and because of this, only one book of it remained. Only one book survived. Later, during the Persian Ashkanian dynasty, one sign that sacred text had been destroyed by fire, so they began to research whether they could reassemble and recompile that text. They began that, and then later Then it was completed during the time of the Sassanid Empire, which was also Persian Empire. And during that time, they were able to finalize the compilation of the text. So the text that we currently have now, if we compare it with the ancient text, it's probably only 1/3 of the text. There's quite a bit of it that is incomplete, but it's still a very important text in terms of the ancient civilization. It's a very important text about the ancient civilization. So in brief, basically, so we continue with the topics of the Asuras. How did the Asuras first occur? What is the origin of the Asuras, the demigods? The researchers cannot really describe exactly what the origins of this are. However, in the Rig Veda, in the very beginning, the Rig Veda was not something that it didn't appear at a certain time. It was also gradually compiled over several centuries. That's what it took to produce the single text that we call the Rig Veda. It wasn't done in a single year or a single generation, right? It took several hundred years and several generations to become complete. And so within the Rig Veda, when they first speak about the Asuras, the word Asura was not used for individuals, for people, for beings. It was actually an adjective. For an example, some gods would have really, really powerful. They'd be called Maya. It was like the power of a demon or the strength of a demon. So it'd be called the power of something. This is called Maya. When you say Maya, it means really great powers. And so those who had these were called Asuras. It's like people who had superpowers, and they were called Asuras. So for this reason, this adjective, Asura, was also used to describe Varuna and Indra and many other gods. And the reason is because this great Maya power, the strength of a demon, and so they were called Asuras. And when this word was used, it was like as an offering of praise. It was like a terrifying god. A terrible god whom we should all be fearful of, someone whom we should be afraid of. And this had the Maya power of a demon, and so it's like a form of a praise of that deity. However, later, the word Asura, gradually, what happened in the Rig Vedas, what eventually happened is that first Asura didn't understand its specific beings, and later became the name of a particular class of a spiritual type of gods. Not only become a specific type of gods, even later, there are some verses in the Rig Veda that say that Indra and Agni are called the Asura slayers, the Asurahan, the ones who kill the demigods or the Asuras. And if we look at this, then the word Asura was thought to mean like a demon at that time. So in the Rig Veda itself, there was a change in the usage of the word. First, it was like an adjective, and it wasn't bad. It was not an adjective for a bad god, but eventually it became understood as a bad god or an evil god. And so the usage of the word changed. Now, after the Rig Vedas, there were the Samaveda and the Yajurveda that appeared in order. And as they developed, then when they explained the Asura, they said the gods in the heavens are the Devas, And the gods who were like their opponents were like in the group of demons, and they were called the asuras, or the demigods. And so the asuras means that they became the opponents of the gods, the adversaries, the ones who were always fighting the gods in battle, who were in conflict with the gods. And so those are what we're talking about as the asuras. So in the Vedas, the asuras are said to be bad. But if you look in the Persian or the Zoroastrian religion, the ahuras were good gods. They were gods of light, the gods of good. So Hura or Sura were the evil gods. So they were called like devils, Arhiman. They're Ashriman, they were called these like demons or bad gods. Likewise, in the Vedas, what it says is that when the gods and the demigods would fight, or the asuras, the gods would always win. And the demigods or the asuras were almost always never achieved any power. I think there's perhaps once, I don't think, did the demigods even achieve a victory once? But basically, there's always the gods who were victorious. But in the Persian Zoroastrian religion, what is it? The asura, the demigods were greater and the gods were lesser. Of course, they didn't call them demigods. They didn't call them non-gods or asuras. The ahura were the greater, and the hura or sura were mad. And when they fought, in the Zoroastrian, there's not description of it, but they had kind of like they had equal strength actually. However, what they believed is that one day the asuras or the way they pronounced it, ahuras, the ahura would be victorious, and the ahriman or the suras, so the ashriman, which is what we call the devas, the gods, would lose, and they would be defeated and be punished. And so this is, and they described in their text, and this is something that they believed fervently. So basically, what is written in the Vedic texts and what is written in the Zoroastrian texts are actually, there's a big connection between the However, these days, in linguistics, people who examine the words, contemporary linguistics say that the word, the origin of the word asura, when they're examining this, the root, the linguistic root of this is the word is asu. Now, what does asu means? It means breathing. If you can't not breathing, then you die, right? And so that's bring that breath. Later, the Brahmins said the asu gave an incorrect explanation of this, or they changed what they thought about it. And the Brahmins then, what they made it into is they made the into a negative particle. So was like a negation. So it's surasan. So was the negative of saying not that. That makes it not gods or the asuras. So they're non-gods. And so they explained the etymology in this way. So actually, so before they used to be gods, but later then they became non-gods. Their conduct was bad. They were evil, and so the gods expelled them from the heavens and exiled them. And so for this reason, the demigods or the asuras so actually the word sura means breath. It wasn't like asura, the and the sura were not divided into two parts. This probably wasn't divided at all. It probably wasn't divided, but they were really firm on it. They're like, this is it. The is a negation. Sura is good. So you need to separate the from the sura. And so then from this way, the word non-gods or demigods arose. But actually, if you think about the language itself, there wasn't a question of whether it had the prefix or not, as it was understood as meaning breathing. Likewise, when we talk about the demigods, and I can also explain it later in our secret mantra, we have Vaishravana, right? We have the Buddha Vaishravana, right? We also have the Yudidu, the Namnang Ngajang, the Verochana Sarvavid. So so this is Verochana. These are also related to the demigods, but I will speak about that more later. And so I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to think that actually the demigods are probably not as bad as we think they are. So the reason is because they're just not included. They didn't get along with the audience, and so for that reason, the ones who stay, or within the audience itself, there were different. There was a dispute within the audience, and those who stayed in India said, "We are good, we're the gods," and the other ones said that we're not those gods, we're the good ones. And so next, I will talk about the second type of demon, which is Rakshas. So in the Rig Veda, the Rakshas or the Rakshas are referred to in the Rig Veda. In particular, among the four Vedas, the fourth of these is the Athara Veda. And so these are the most frequently seen demon in the Athara Veda. So when you talk about the non-gods are the ones who opposed the gods, who harmed the gods, and so they were called the demigods or the asuras. The Rakshas are the ones who harmed humans, the ones who opposed humans. So they were called Rakshas. This is the name given to them. So how is it that Rakshas harmed humans? Well, the Rakshas would take different physical forms, and they'd use different forms and different shapes to harm humans. And they took the different shapes or forms. Sometimes they would emanate as dogs, sometimes as vultures, sometimes they would emanate as owls, and they'd move around at night. They'd come to where people were and harm them. Sometimes the Rakshas would take the form of a man or a husband and harm the women and children. And particularly what it says in this is there's a particular type of Rakshas called the Yatudhanas. So what this means is that these particular Rakshas were especially good at casting spells and curses. They were the sorcerers. And they ate human flesh, they ate horse flesh, like as they drank cow milk. They probably stole the cow milk. And so in this way, stealing cow milk, because before the custom they would come and suck out all of the milk. But in any case, they harmed humans and their livestock. Or these Rakshas would come in the form of food, and then people would eat them, and they'd cause an illness and pain. And so for this reason, everyone at that time was really terrified of the Rakshasas. And so it used different methods to get rid of the Rakshasas, such as reciting mantras or giving sacrifices to Agni. And the reason why, the reason to make offerings to Agni is because Agni is one who is called the demon slayer, right? So so they would worship Agni in particular to harm the Rakshas. Then the next is the third type of demon. And the third type is the Pishachas. In our mantras, we talk about the Pishacha Parashavari, right? The Pishachas are, we also call them, in Tibetan, we call them flesh eaters. They're like a type of ghost. Another name for them is the corpse eaters. And calling them corpse eaters is good because Rakshas would eat also meat, but if the corpse eater, if you call them corpse eaters, that's a little bit different. They eat corpses, and that they're called kravyad. They're called kravyad. I don't know how to pronounce it. So these are Pishachas, as I said before. The demigods are the ones who opposed and harmed the gods. The Rakshas are the ones who opposed humans and harmed humans. So those are the Rakshas. So who do the Pishachas harm? So the Pishachas are the ones who harm our ancestors. How do you harm the ancestors? It is by eating their corpses. They eat corpses, right? And when you eat the corpse, then during the time of the Rig Vedas, at that time they didn't cremate corpses. Instead, what they did is they buried the corpses underground. So the Pishachas would come and eat the corpses. And when they ate the corpses, then the people of that time and they considered it very important to keep the corpse whole and intact because that corpse, after the person died, said because it was beneficial for the people to have the corpse after they were deceased, after they died. But with the Pishachas would come and they'd eat the corpses of the ancestors, and for that they're called the flesh eaters or the corpse eaters. So no one liked them at all. So there are people there was no one in particular who made offerings or sacrifices for them. And because they're a type of god, that was like anyone could give any protection. And so later researchers say that among the 6 classes of beings that we speak about, that later the hunger ghosts were based upon the Pishachas. And so that's what when we talk about hunger ghosts, that's probably what we understand. So there are people who do explain this. So that's the 3 types of demons. So basically, as I've spoken, I've introduced many different types of gods and demons, right? There are a whole lot of different gods that I've introduced. And if you think there's so many gods and there's so many, it's like, what are the connections between gods and humans? Or when people of that time worshipped gods, how did they view the god? How did they see the gods? So in general terms, the ancient Indian people believed is that all the Vedic gods were transcended humans or greater humans in their magical powers. However, their character was very similar to human characters. So in terms of human characters, they're the same as humans. In particular, the Vedic gods. When we ever think of gods, we think of people who behave well, who are good, right? But in the Rig Vedic, in the Vedic gods, the Vedic literature, the gods do all sorts of different things. They always take boxes. It's like you have to. There's like, it's like you had to pay them always bakshish, right? Sometimes they would sleep with their sisters. And they do all sorts of different things. do all sorts of different things. They're basically the same as people. They're very powerful, but in terms of their character, they're exactly the same as humans. And people did everything, everything terrible to. So what people thought is that the gods are very powerful, but in terms of their characters, they're the same as us, they thought. And so for that reason, the connection between gods and humans was a connection of profit, or of benefit, or of exchange of profit. And so when you talk about it like an exchange of profit, it's like if I'm giving you an offering, and now you do what I want you to do. It's like there's a commercial transaction. It's in order to get a profit, right? It's not sort of thinking, oh, the gods are this wonderful, that you are the only protection, refuge, and guardian we have. Thinking of the god as like a lord and us and ourselves as a subject. Instead, it's kind of like a think about the prophet somehow better. It's not like the bodhisattvas and Buddhas and bodhisattvas who have no help, no wish for any response or any thanks. It's the gods in the Vedas. If you didn't make offerings to them, they wouldn't protect you. And the people would make the offerings, and if the gods did not help, then the people wouldn't make offerings anymore. This is basically the same of us. It's basically thinking about the same way. It's trying to get a profit out of each other, right? And the reason for this is that in the Rig Veda, there are many different types of sacrifices. And among all the different types of sacrifices, most of them are mainly making requests and making requests to the gods and making prayers, but there are no rituals for offering thanks. They didn't have any thought of gratitude. It's like, I made you this offering, and now you do it. It's like, that's how it should be. There are no rituals of saying, thank you, I feel grateful. And so for this reason, the connection between the gods and the people was at that time very easy. The people would supplicate and make the offerings, and they'd tell the gods what they want. And then the gods, after they received the offering, would go do what the people asked. And so it's basically, that's the work we're doing a business deal. And so in the end, that's what it's really like. And so if we think about it's like a commercial, or it's like business. That's the way that the Indian people felt it. And so for that reason, the ritual is very important, because so when you're having the discussions and the negotiations and the business between the humans and gods, you had to have the rituals. And it's like when you're talking about what you want to do, you have to have the rituals. And so for this reason, the Vedic texts have many different rituals. For example, if you think about in the Christian rituals, God is something that's supreme, our savior, and we're like the subjects, and we have to obey and do whatever they say, and we need to always be submissive. But there's no thought of that in the Indian tradition. And so for this reason, the connections between the gods and the most important aspect of it was making the sacrifices and offerings to the gods. And because when you do the sacrifice of the god is the only avenue for creating a connection between gods and humans. So when you talk about a sacrifice, is like the sacrifices are like the basis and the vital element of Vedic learning and the Vedic text of Vedic philosophy. Actually, I've probably been working too hard. I think I have to have a little bit of water. So next, during the Vedic period, there are the sacrifice. So what are the stages of sacrificial rituals? What was it? So to give you a brief introduction to that. So first, during the time of the Rig Veda, that is during the very beginning of the Vedic period, there wasn't any special building or assembly hall where sacrifices were held. So the sacrifices were held in private houses in one's own house. So you do it inside your own house. And when you do it inside, what you do in the center, you'd have the hearth for the fire puja. And the place where the hearth where you throw the offerings, right? So in the center, you have to have an offering. This is similar to ours. And on the sides, on either side, on the side of the other, there was the altar. We call it a mandala, but in the Vedas, so this formerly it's called a Vedian altar, but now it's we call them. And then on top of that, they'd make seats of kusha grass. So leave it empty. So the reason why they left it empty there is that they think that they'd invite the gods, and then the god would come and sit on this grass, and so that is what they believed. But at that time, there was no tradition of making representations of the gods. And they would have a kind of a raised area, and they'd make it very level on top, spread kusha grass on top, and then leave it open, and otherwise leave it empty. And they'd then think that they're inviting the god who would come down and sit on the altar. And so I think that the mandalas that we do probably originated from this. At that time, there's something kind of a digression from that. When we talk about a mandala, so in Tibetan, that's called a chilkota, right? So a mandala in ancient India you need to build a kind of a four-sided mandala and build it. You have to actually make it. It wasn't like it is today, where we have something we pick up with our hands, hold in our hands that's made of bronze or gold and silver that we can pick up. No, there wasn't anything like that in India before. There probably wasn't. All the mandalas were things that you actually had to make yourself. You had to build, and then you have to shellac it, and then fire the clay. And so the mandalas. So in the Tenjuru, we have many different mandala rituals, and most of them are talking about making mandalas out of clay. So they're built, these are all about using clay mandalas. Likewise, there's a quote from the Mandala Sutra where it talks about is building, is generosity, cleaning it, is cleansing it as patience, and killing sentient beings as patience. Now, when we have the metal mandalas we hold in our hands, the explanation doesn't have to be, because we said that cleaning it is so cleaning out or removing the living beings is patience, it says. Because when you make one mandala out of earth, there are many different insects in it, right? Otherwise, when you're doing the ritual, you need to brush away the insects, and so this is why it's called patience. But when we have this gold or silver medal, how can insects get on it? When you have a metal mandala, you see, we wipe something with, but maybe a little bit of, unless we put honey on it, the bugs won't come. And so for this reason, in the ancient days, the mandalas in the ancient times were made out of clay, and then fired. And so I will speak about this again at greater length in the future. So after they'd built the mandala, and so these days, the person who was sitting there would also recite an hymn and an aspiration to this and then put all the offerings into the hearth of the century. And when offering it to the hearth, they would think that the gods had accepted the offerings. Later, when the Yajurveda, so during the Rig Veda, it was like that, but later in the Rig Veda, they had more different hearths, so one in the center, north, and south. So they had a tradition of making 3 different hearths. Likewise, with the mandala or the altars, there became to be many different types. So it became more and more elaborate. And the offerings they gave to the gods at that time were primarily the kind of the foodstuffs that people usually ate, milk and cheese, because of wheat, different types of seeds, types of meat, or different types of beverages. And in particular, the soma alcohol was, as I said before, all of the gods liked alcohol. And also the ancestors really liked alcohol. So you absolutely had to offer the alcohol. So you needed a lot of gong. And also there were animal sacrifices. There were also many different types of churches. And the animals that were sacrificed, there were many different types, but the main ones at that time were cattle and horses and goats and sheep and so forth. And the sacrifice is if the god rode a bull, then you'd offer a bull. If they rode a goat, you'd offer a goat. Likewise, even in very ancient times, at the very beginning of the Veda times, or in even more ancient times, they figure that there must have been human sacrifices at that time, but it died out and was not continued later. So who performed the ritual? It was, whatever household is the head of the household, whether the father or the eldest son or whoever it was, they would perform the sacrifice. But sometimes if it was a really elaborate ritual or a really complicated ritual, and the head of the household would be like the sponsor that would be sponsored, and this is called a yajamana. He'd be the sponsor. And invite people in particular to come and perform the sacrifices. And so before they come, first you make them an offering. This is called a dakshina. And so you give the dakshina offering, and after that, then they'd invite the priest to perform the sacrifice. And this priest was called Ritvij. I'm not sure how to say it. Something like Ritvij. They'd invite this priest to officiate and perform the sacrifice. So now, before the Aryans had arrived in India, there were probably particular priests who performed the sacrifices and so forth. But later, after the Rig Veda appeared, became even more powerful than before, and there were then many different types of them. So there became different types or ranks of the priests. But when you talk about the priest, the Ritvij said that, and the Rig Veda said that there should be the 4 kinds, or the Ritvij. And so there should be 4 types of the priests, so Ritvij. So there are 4 kinds of these priests. they divide the four people and divide the work of doing the sacrifice among these four people. Now, the four Ridvij, the first of these is called the sacrificer, and the second was the chanter. The third is the sacrificer or the Brahmer. Now, I think we can speak about this all tomorrow, so I'm getting a little bit tired, and so I think it's probably better to speak about this day after tomorrow. Tomorrow is a day off. Now, it's a day off for you, but it's not for me. I actually have more work on the days off. And so we will leave it here today, and then so we will speak about the priests at the sacrifices, the four types of priests at sacrifices. So in general, when we talk about the origins of secret mantra, when we're speaking about the history of secret mantra, now the reason why we have to speak about so much of this material, maybe it's better just to continue speaking. It's a little bit difficult, but probably better to just say it. Otherwise, I'm never gonna finish. Yeah, better just to tell. So these four sacrificial priests are spoken about in the Rig Veda. And during the sacrifice, each of them had a different job, a different function. The first of these is the preparatory one. It was called the Advaryu. It's the Advaryu, and their job was to kind of oversee and to prepare. He's the one who did all the work for the ritual. So what he would do is he'd first measure the place where the rituals be conducted, the size of the mandala, and prepare all of the altar and arrange all of the substances needed for the ritual. And he'd get all the firewood and the water, and if it's going to be an animal sacrifice, he'd get the animal to be sacrificed. He would do all of these, and then later, what he would recite would be in a very low voice. He'd recite what are called the yajus in a very low voice. That is what it said. Now, the second type of priest was called the Udgatar. Probably say the Udgatri. So this is the one who offers the hymns to the gods, and his responsibility was to sing the hymns of the view. Like the Indians did, they play the music and as they recite the hymns in praise of the gods. So that was his responsibility. He was kind of like our umze, our chant master. So along with the music, he would sing the hymns with a melody. So he would sing different summons and different offering songs as appropriate for the ritual, whether long or short. And the present type of priest is called the Hotri. The Hotri means the one who performs the fire offering, who invites the deity. And so what he would do is he would recite the words of the vases to invite the deities to the altar or to the mandala. And what he would recite were like what we call the rich. These are the rich, besides in the Rig Veda, so he recites these rich praises from memory. Now, the fourth type of priest was called the Brahman. And so if we talk of translated to Tibetan, it's Jamse. So what this Brahmin would do, his responsibility was to supervise it and see whether the ritual was being performed properly or not. So to oversee everything. So this Brahmin is from the lineage of these Brahmins, these priests that the Brahmin caste had developed. So he was at a higher status than the other of the priests because he's the one who oversaw them all, right? Likewise, he needed to know all the different aspects of the purity. He also needed to do that. He also recite the prayers to the gods and so forth on behalf of the responsibilities. So this is another responsibility he carried. So the fourth of the priest in the sacrifice needed to be completely trained in all of the responsibilities of the other three types of priests. Otherwise, he'd be unable to do this work, right? And so in the past, when they did the sacrifices, the people performed the sacrifices. The individuals, they needed the four types of individuals to do these sacrifices. So that's how it was. And so that completes our discussion of the early Vedic period. So from the day after tomorrow, we'll speak about the later Vedic period. So what I was going to say before is that, so generally this year we're speaking about the history of secret mantra, but before we speak about the history of mantra, we need to understand the background and the history of Indian civilization. Only when we understand that can we understand how Buddhism spread. Why did it spread? What are the qualities or the features of Buddhism? And so how is it that the Buddha thought at that time? What were her own particular deeds? So I'm teaching this in order that we can clearly understand that. Likewise, first we have the first there's Shravaka, the listeners, and then there was the Mahayana, and then there was the secret mantra. I think so. The stages, the Buddha arose in stage, and so we can have a good idea of how the complete teachings of the Buddha arose. And so for that reason, should understand that the reason that I'm speaking about all of this, even if you don't understand it completely, fully now, then later you might be able to say, oh, there's some sort of a person. There's a reason why he explained it. He definitely had a reason for it. So it's possible that you might think this, and so this is why. So there's no reason for you to get worried, thinking, or anxious, thinking he's supposed to teach about secret mantra Vajrayana, but he's speaking about other things. I think instead of being anxious like that, don't worry, just relax and be fine. So this year we've increased the time now, but it's going to be difficult. Still, it's going to be difficult to cover the whole thing. So if I explain too much all at once, then it's difficult for me, and it's also difficult for you listeners. If I say everything at once, you won't understand it all. When you put too many different things into your brain all at once, then your mind and you are unable to understand it. You kind of go blank. And so for that reason, I can't explain all of the different aspects, but I'll speak about the most important aspects of the situation. So I'm gathering these all together, and so I'm trying to explain these all to you. And so I think if you please listen to it with this understanding. So now please recite the dedication prayers.